All right, we move to another new aspect, that is piece bundle pacing. Many potential indications, but is it ready for prime time is the question here, and Ken Ellenbogen has the answer.
Thank you. So here's the answer. His bundle pacing is ready for prime time. My disclosures. Again, I'm going to try to break up my talk into just mentioning anatomy, talk about results of experienced implanters, talk about the results in new implanters, and then present some long-term follow-up data on the use of his bundle pacing. Just a reminder in terms of anatomy, for those of us or those of you who implant a his bundle pacemaker, we're talking about implanting the tip of the lead above the plane of the septal leaflet of the tricuspid valve. And so how well the implant works depends to some extent on the anatomy of the his bundle. And there are basically three different types of anatomy of how the his bundle passes through the membranous septum, how insulated it is, and how long and easy it is to stimulate. So here is the literature with respect to permanent his bundle pacing, and this is a paper that was published in the Europace that was a systematic literature review and meta-analysis. First author was Francesco Zanin, that looked at all the papers published in terms of series of patients who had his bundle pacing, and in table 2 we have the patient characteristics, the number of papers that reported patient age, men versus women, indication for pacing, QRS duration, cardiac function. And basically, the majority of patients underwent his bundle pacing were treated for AV block. Patient age, sex, and comorbidities reflect that of a typical pacemaker patient population. So this is just the Prisma flow diagram for the literature review and meta-analysis, and this is the take-home message. If you look at time, that is first year of enrollment, and particularly look at patients who had a lead that appears to be particularly useful, or the one that's been used in the majority of the attempts to pace a conduction system, his bundle whatsoever, one looks at the implant success, we can see over time that varies from about 75% to 90%. So it's all over the place, but in general above 70%, and there are some centers reporting up to 90%. Now, the second thing people ask about is what kind of thresholds can I expect from his bundle pacing? This is baseline thresholds, that is the mean threshold from implant, certainly probably 2 times or even 3 times what you might expect from placing a lead in the right ventricular apex. This is a threshold at 3 months, or when patients come back for their first follow-up visit, and this is the quote-unquote chronic threshold when they're seen sometime after 3 months. So the thresholds in general can be between 1 to 2 volts, show a wide variation. Now, this is a single center, 2 experienced implanters, and this is their learning curve. 2010, they implanted 40 leads in the his bundle position. 2011, 94. 2013, 108. And you see the implant success is at Geisinger, so this is results of Pugazendi Vijay Raman, went from 75% to 91%, whereas the fluoroscopy time went from 17 minutes to 10 minutes. Pacing thresholds went from 2.4 volts to 1.4 volts. So an improvement over time with volume. Now this is data that was lent to me by Zachary Winnett. This is from the prospective randomized trial being done in England, and you can see this is for different centers, and you see as the number of cases, as you look at the number of cases per center, you can see the fluoroscopy time goes down dramatically, or goes down significantly, from 14 minutes towards 11 minutes. This is unpublished data, which he was willing to share with me, and you see overall the thresholds for non-selective pacing versus selective pacing. And you can see it's over 2 volts for non-selective, around 1 to 1.5 volts for selective. And depending upon the different types of conduction disease, for example, for left bundle branch block reversal versus lowest capture threshold. And I'll talk more about this, although this is unpublished data. I won't show you any more, only to make the point that the more you do, shown here in the number of cases per center, the better you do and the quicker you do at getting it done. So this is the only study that I'm aware of. This is a study published about 6 or 9 months ago in JACC EP, and it looks at a single center. We actually trained the first implanter in Richmond, Sunit Mittal, came, spent a day with us, saw 3 or 4 implants, and then went back and trained a couple of his partners. And he looked at so it's a single center observational trial where his bundle pacing, so this is sequential, 101 implants out of 427 implants between 2015 and 2017, okay? And it was not considered successful if the pace Q restoration was greater than 130 milliseconds, because that implies you're not pacing the conduction system, you're pacing the septal myocardium. Or if the normal intrinsic Q restoration or pace Q restoration was actually greater than the intrinsic Q restoration, people have bundle branch block. He saw the patients 1 to 2 weeks, 1, 6, and 12 months. That's their routine. Mean fluoroscopy time was 10 plus or minus 7 minutes when successful. When unsuccessful, it was 24 plus or minus 15 minutes. And his bundle capture threshold was greater than 2.5 to 3.3 volts in about 13% of patients. They had 74% of patients followed up at 6 months. Half of the patients followed up at 12 months, and 22% of the patients followed up at 24 months. So here's the data, and they compared it to a group of patients, a contemporary group of patients, where they did not attempt his bundle pacing. And you see overall patients are fairly similar, except in the patients who had lower EFs, it was more likely not to put a his bundle lead in, but put a CRT system in. And there were really no significant differences in patient characteristics other than the selecting patients that had a low EF for CRT systems. And so his overall success was about 75%. So 76 out of 101 patients, he was able to successfully implant a conduction system disease after 1 day of education. And that's an experienced implanter, device implanter. For narrow QRS patients, he was successful in implanting a lead in 83%, and for bundle branch block patients, he was successful in implanting a lead in about 65% of patients. Again, breaking out patients into patients who have Mobitz 1 and Mobitz 2 block, about 83% success rate, and that they have complete heart block, 56% success rate. This just breaking it down further, Mobitz 1 versus Mobitz 2, complete heart block. Now, then if you look at patients who did not have bundle branch block but have Mobitz 1 or Mobitz 2 block, you can see it's 88 versus 72. And then if they had Mobitz 1 versus Mobitz 2 and complete heart block, but they did have a bundle branch block, the success rate for pacing a patient in complete heart block, say, or Mobitz 2 block, who had a wide QRS, was about 62%. Now, as I said, the overall success rate was 76%. It was, or 75%. It was 75 or 76 out of 101 patients. But if you look at his success for the first 1 to 33 patients, it was 76%. Then cases 34 to 66, it was a little bit lower. And then once he got the hang of it, it's a bit higher, 83% in the last 28 patients. So there's clearly, definitely a learning curve. So I wanted to end my talk with just to make a point about the real-world use of his bundle pacing leads. This is a presentation we gave about a year ago, and we have not published it yet. But this is data from CareLink remote follow-up. So there have been over almost 7,000 patients who have the 3830 lead, which was used, and of those, about 4,000 patients had his bundle pacing, and we have follow-up data on about 85% of it. That's follow-up transmissions on about 3,500 out of 4,000 patients. And just to show you what the overall results are. With follow-up of about a year, you can see about 92% of patients still have a functional His bundle pacing lead at 2 years follow-up, and we have only 100 patients at 2 years, but about 90% of patients are still have their His bundle lead pacing, okay? Again, a relatively small number of patients have their His bundle lead inactivated, and it doesn't matter whether they have a single chamber, dual chamber, or CRT. Now, this shows you if their His bundle lead is being used in a single chamber or dual chamber pulse generator or CRT pacemaker. You can see the overall pacing output. We obviously can't know the pacing thresholds, are around 3.5 to 4 volts in patients. So that's consistent with a mean pacing threshold of about 1.7. In these patients, the pacing amplitudes double. So you see the outputs are basically running at around 3.5 to 4 volts in most patients. Change in pacing outputs up to 6 months. How often is the device reprogrammed? Not that often. The device is neither reprogrammed in terms of amplitude or pulse width, very, very rarely. And this is the percent pacing. So people who have a His bundle pacemaker, a lot of people put them in patients who have 6 sinus syndrome, anticipating their use later on. And then there's about 40% of patients who have His bundle pacing 100% of the time, and about another 10% of patients who have His bundle pacing greater than 10% of the time. This is the only paper published, which we published on long-term follow-up of permanent His bundle pacing. These are patients who came in for pulse generator change. First of all, I want to make a couple of observations. Here's the patient's baseline EKG. You may not be able to see this, but the patient has 2 to 1 AV block. So 2 to 1 AV block with a heart rate of about 35 to 40. And this is His bundle pacing here. Looks pretty good. QRS is pretty narrow. Of course, this is non-selective His bundle pacing. And then 5 years later, you see the QRS also looks just as narrow. So EKG looks good. And basically, it's a very small group of patients, 20 patients. Their His bundle pacing thresholds at implant were 1.95 volts, and at the time of generator change were 2.5 volts. So I'd gone up a little bit, but only 1 of 20 patients at 5 years required a new His bundle lead due to increase in pacing threshold. So relatively low, but you can see the patients maintain great QRS duration at implant doesn't change. HV interval doesn't change, and the improvement in cardiac function remains the same, whether you look at it at time of implant or 5 years later. So I think the take-home message is the future for His bundle pacing is bright and exciting. We need to prove generalizability and long-term stability of pacing thresholds. 20 patients at 5 years is not an overwhelming data size. Which patients might need a backup lead? We need better tools for shorter implant times. I think one thing clearly that is needed is larger batteries, potentially even change in pacing waveform. So there's some data that biphasic pacing thresholds may allow you to pace a His bundle with much lower pacing outputs. And I think I would argue that the time for conduction system pacing is now. I think this is truly physiologic pacing. That's what everyone wants. And I think we're at where we were in 1996, 1997, when we had LV leads. Only LV leads we had were time leads that did not go over wire. So we had very little steerability. So I think this is like 20-something years ago for CRT pacing. We just need better tools and maybe some different waveforms that make thresholds lower. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being in.